President Reagan put it best when he said, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction.
Wow.
We don't pass it on in the bloodline. It has to be fought for and preserved generation after generation.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast. This show's available on Apple, Google, Spotify, Edify, Liftable, wherever you get your podcast. 14 different channels now, I think it's available. If you like the show, please take just a moment to review it on your favorite platform. That way more people can find out about these interviews and learn from major thought leaders from many fields of influence who show how our worldview changes everything. My guest today is the Vice President of External Affairs, Director of Military Affairs, and Senior Counsel for First Liberty Institute. He's a recognized subject matter expert on how religious liberty affects everything that's happening in our world today. He earned his law degree from the Ohio State University. He's testified before Congress, and he is routinely invited to speak across the nation about the critical issue of religious freedom. Please welcome Michael Berry to the show. Mike Berry, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
Well, I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I think a whole lot of the organization that you're a part of, the First Liberty Institute, and the work that you do there on behalf of religious freedom is incredible. And I'd like to specifically focus on, as we're thinking about justice and our nation and what's really important this month, I'm really curious about some of the religious liberty issues related to the military, but just in general, but also in the military, which is your specific focus as a veteran who is an attorney. And thank you for your service, by the way.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, it's certainly a passion of mine, and I like to think of it as I continue to support and defend the Constitution. I just wear a different uniform now.
I love that. That's so good. Well, tell us just a little bit about the First Liberty Institute so we can get some context. And then I'm going to start peppering you with questions about why religious liberty is even something we need to be talking about.
Sure. Well, First Liberty Institute is actually the largest legal organization in the country that focuses exclusively on religious liberty. So we're a law firm, a nonprofit organization, which means that everything we do is pro bono. None of our clients will ever receive a bill from us. But we really only have one practice area, one area of focus in the law, and that's religious liberty. Our mission is to advance religious freedom for all Americans. And so we represent people from many different faith groups because we find that minority faith groups often find themselves facing religious hostility and persecution. And we believe that religious freedom for one is religious freedom for all. And that's important as Americans, that we ensure that that constitutional principle is not only defended, but advanced in our courts and in the public sphere.
So the First Amendment to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, which the founders passed relatively soon after they passed the Constitution, specifies that we have the freedom of religion, the freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom to assemble, freedom to seek a redress for our grievances. 5 core things. Religious freedom is first there in that list. Is there a reason why it's first, or was that just it just happened to be the first in the list?
Well, I mean, I think that, right, if you ask any person to make a list of things that they want to protect or things that are important, right? If you ask anybody, hey, if your house is on fire, I want you to write down a list of the top 10 things that you would want to save and protect from your house. I imagine they're going to list the most important things to them first, right? They're not going to just come up with sort of I guess I've got a bonsai tree that's in my home office, maybe save that one, and then go on down the list and be like, oh, and also my family members and my pets and my life savings somewhere at the bottom. So I think it's human nature. I think it's pretty common sense to accept that the framers of the Constitution and the founders of this country, they put first things first for a reason, right? In fact, we call them first principles and first things precisely because they are the things that need to come first. And so it's more than just, I'm being a little bit tongue in cheek here, but if you strip away religious freedom, then it becomes very, very easy to strip away every other freedom. And all you have to do is talk to somebody who grew up under a totalitarian regime, talk to somebody who grew up behind the Iron Curtain, right? Or somebody who has come to this country from a totalitarian nation. And there are plenty of those around the world, right? There are plenty of places that are run by despots and dictators. And you talk to them and you ask them, what freedoms did you have when you lived in that country? And they'll be very quick to tell you and to point out they did not have religious freedom. And what's most interesting is that when it was a country that at one time enjoyed religious freedom and no longer enjoys religious freedom, more often than not, they'll tell you religious freedom was the first thing that was taken away. Because once you take away the right of the people to recognize an authority that's higher than the government itself becomes the ultimate authority figure, right? And so that's the whole point behind religious freedom, is it gives the right of the people to say, no, we submit to an authority that's higher than the government. The government is subservient to the people. And that's exactly how our nation was founded. That's why our Constitution begins with we the people, not you the government.
That's such a powerful point. And so religious freedom, religious liberty is the first liberty, which is why your organization is called the First Liberty Institute. But in the founding documents, you see this statement of government does not give you your rights. It secures the blessings of liberty for the people. And wow, when people lose that, it's unbelievable what we've lost. But I still think a lot of people are saying, well, you can go to church whenever you want. What's the problem? What is it exactly when people lose religious liberty that's being lost?
The greatest threat to freedom is actually not the threat of force, of having freedoms taken away by force. The greatest threat to freedom is apathy. Because when people become apathetic, in other words, when they just take for granted the freedoms that they have, and they don't actually live out their lives in a way that fully appreciates those freedoms, those freedoms are slowly eroded. It's the old saying of how do you boil a bullfrog? If you drop a bullfrog into a pot of boiling water, it's just going to jump right out because it's going to say this water is too hot for me, right? But if you turn up the heat on the water very slowly, gradually, you're going to boil the bullfrog. And that's because the bullfrog becomes apathetic. It becomes comfortable and complacent in that water until eventually it's boiled to death. And that's what we see in many nations that once had strong and robust religious freedom protections and no longer do, is because the people failed to stand up for their rights. It wasn't, somebody didn't just march in and say, give me all your freedoms or else, because they know people will stand up to that. People stand up to bullies and dictators more often than not. But usually when you have a country that's free and the people don't understand, President Reagan put it best when he said, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. Wow. We don't pass it on in the bloodline. It has to be fought for and preserved generation after generation. And my fear is that what we're seeing in our country is that people have for too long been sort of asleep and just assume that the way things have always been are the way things are always going to be. And that's not the case. It takes people standing up and saying, no, I have the freedom to do X, Y, and Z, and then to say, and I'm going to live that out in my life. Not just, you mentioned, the freedom. People say, oh, you have the freedom to go to church. You can go to your synagogue or your temple or your church and do whatever you need to do there. No, that's not what the Constitution says. It says that we have the freedom to live out that faith in every aspect of our life, beyond the walls of the church, the synagogue, the temple. We can live out our faith in our workplace. We can live out our faith in our personal lives, in our public lives, if we're government officials, if we're private employees of a corporation, whatever the case might be.
Mike, a lot of people look back at the founders during this time of the year and they wonder what they were thinking and how they put their ideas together. They wrote voluminously about this, but you have to really be persistent to dig into it. But they had a chance to actually form a national church, the way it had been formed in England. And they chose to not do that. I mean, so the religious freedom to them meant not only the freedom to practice their religion, but the freedom from a particular government church as well. Is that, what were they thinking about at that time, and why is the idea of a national church that we put a stamp on, actually harmful to religious freedom?
There's a fancy term that many of us at one time learned, probably in seventh grade social studies or American history, or even political science, if you took that in college, and the term is called federalism, right? The concept of federalism is to sort of have this separation and this balance between the federal government and state and local governments, and sort of where does the balance of power lie. And our founders, many of them, not all of them, they had disputes about this. I mean, you can read in the Federalist Papers about the debates that they had going back and forth about this. But a lot of the disputes were about where should that balance of power lie, and especially on this matter that you just brought up, right? The establishment of religion or of a state church. Here's what's interesting. If you go back and just read the documents, right? We have them available to us. You can, people can read them for themselves. That's part of being in a free country. What I was just talking about with apathy, the way you fight against apathy is you got to do the work and read, and start digging up these documents like the Constitution, that Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Papers, so on and so forth. But you'll see what they said was they didn't want a federal church, right? A national church. Because they just left that, right? The Church of England, and it had a very, very heavy hand, right, on the colonists, and that's exactly what they fought for in the War of Independence, is to get away from that, from having this national federal church. But at the same time, they didn't have any problem with there being state churches, because at the time the Constitution was drafted and the Bill of Rights was ratified, and the First Amendment was ratified, saying Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, right? Which is what we all now understand to mean you can't have a government church, right? That just about every single one of the 13 colonies, with a couple of exceptions here and there, had a state church in that colony. And I do this, I speak to law students, I talk at law schools around the country, and I'll usually just do a little pop quiz, and I'll ask them, I say, so for example, if you were a Quaker, where do you think you probably would have lived in the time of the American colonies?
Pennsylvania.
And they say Pennsylvania, right? And if you were an Anglican, where would you have been?
Virginia.
Virginia. If you were a Catholic, where would you have lived? In Maryland, right? Because Maryland was founded as a Catholic colony, and they all intuitively get that, right? They know the answer to those questions. And I say, so how do you think it would have gone over if the United States Congress said, yeah, the United States of America is going to be a Catholic nation, right? There would have been an immediate rebellion, except in Maryland, right? Yeah. People in Maryland would have been probably pretty happy, and everybody else would have been ready to go to war. And you can insert any other denomination in place of Catholic, and you would have had the same outcome, right? And so, but at the same time, the founders didn't have any problem with Maryland being established as a Catholic colony, or Pennsylvania having, or New York, or so on and so forth. So that was the balance that they struck, right? Is, you know what? States can kind of have their thing, or the colonies can do their thing, but the federal government is not going to establish a federal religion, because we don't want to show favoritism to any one particular religion or denomination at the expense of the others. And people, then of course they're law students, right? So they want to ask questions. They say, well, how did we get to where we are today, which is where we have this sort of this so-called separation of church and state that essentially pervades every aspect of government, from the federal level all the way down to, like, your local school board, right? Where you see a school board wants to open their school board meeting in prayer, and somebody stands up and says, "You can't do that. That violates the separation of church and state," which, by the way, is completely false. School boards can open their meetings in prayer. There are plenty of court cases that say that. Supreme Court has said that type of prayer is perfectly permissible under the Constitution. So that's a misnomer. But the way that we got there was in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, there was this legal doctrine that was essentially created out of thin air called the doctrine of incorporation. And what that means is they took aspects of constitutional principles and law that only were intended to apply to the federal government and began incorporating them to state and local governments.
Okay.
That's why it's called the doctrine of incorporation. So it's sort of, things started to go off the rails, right? Basically post-Civil War, early 20th century, and there's a whole, we don't have enough time in the day to talk about all the reasons why that was the case. That's just the short, 30,000-foot view explanation of how we got to where we are today.
Yeah, I'd love to follow that thought a little bit by some of the other battles. I'm really struck by the point that you've made that freedom is something that has to be fought for. So just because it's in the Constitution doesn't mean it's always going to happen that way. What are some of the battles that sort of have outlined, sort of set us up for where we are with our current challenges for religious liberty?
Well, I got to start off by saying exactly as you said, right? It has to be fought for. And that's exactly why First Liberty Institute exists. I mean, that is our mission, right? Is to preserve religious freedom in this country for all Americans. So I'm very proud to be a part of this organization that we essentially put our money where our mouth is, right? Where we say, when we tell people, hey, you're not always going to be free, you got to fight for it. And then, and then we basically say, and guess what? We're the ones doing the fighting. We're doing the fighting for you because, millions of Americans, tens of millions of Americans get up every, whether it's Saturday morning, Sunday morning, they get in their car and they go to their place of worship, right? Church, synagogue, temple, or whatever. And that's how they live out their faith, is by going to their place of worship on a Saturday or a Sunday morning, or whatever the case might be. But think about how many tens of millions of Americans more than that have to get up on Monday morning and go to work, right? And that's what preoccupies most of their time, right? It's thinking about how they're going to make a living, how they're going to put a roof over their family's head, how they're going to put food on the table. And they don't necessarily, and through no fault of their own, I mean, they're hardworking, honest Americans, but they're not necessarily thinking about, how do I ensure that my children and my grandchildren are going to enjoy the same freedoms that I have, right? To live out my faith openly and freely. And so we feel like we are the ones standing in that gap for them, right? Basically saying, that's why we're here, right? We're fighting for that for you so that you don't have to worry about that, when you're going about your life. And so where the battle lines are currently being drawn, though, I mean, it's really everywhere. All right. You can hardly, we used to say, open the paper. I think, that's probably showing our age, right? Nobody opens the paper anymore. Now I say, turn on, used to say, and then you would say, turn on the news. I don't think anybody turns on the news anymore. So I guess, turn on my phone, and that's how I get the news now, right? It's fed to me, and nary a day goes by without a headline or two talking about some new threat to religious freedom. And so the very latest one, I mean, just hot off the press, is it's actually an old threat that just keeps getting repackaged and repackaged and repackaged. And they keep trying to deliver it in a different way. And it's court packing, of all things, right?
Wow.
So again, going back to, put on your 7th grade U.S. history, hat, and you get your time machine, go back to the 7th grade, and you probably learned about FDR, President Franklin Roosevelt, and his court packing plan back in the 1930s, right? When basically the Supreme Court at that time was striking down a lot of his policies and New Deal policies that he wanted to push through just through executive fiat, right? I'm the president. I get to decide what's in the best interest of the country. I'm ordering XYZ. The Supreme Court said, no, that's not how it works in this country, right? We have separation of powers. Laws, Congress is who creates laws, not the president, right? And the Supreme Court was saying, and it's our job as the court to hold you accountable. And so they would strike down a lot of his legislation. He got very upset by that. And he said, fine, you're going to strike down my legislation. I'm going to change. I'm going to reform the courts. And the way he reformed the courts was by proposing that because our Supreme Court justices have life tenure, right? Federal judges, once you're confirmed, you're on the court for life. And he said, so I can't fire them. I can't get rid of them because they're on there for life. So what right now, we have 9 justices on the Supreme Court. And he said, well, if I make it 15 or 17 or, 19 justices, I can be the one that chooses who the new justices are going to be. And they'll all vote for me, and they'll all vote in favor of my policies every single time. So it became known as court packing, right? You add new seats, and then you pack those seats with your hand-picked people. Well, this is exactly what we're seeing the far left calling for today. They're not calling it court packing because they know court packing has a bad connotation. They're calling it judicial reform or court reform.
Wow.
And they're saying we need to reform our courts. We need to have term limits on how long justices can serve. And if we can't get term limits, then maybe we ought to think about adding more seats onto the Supreme Court. I know it just so happens that we have a president right now who would probably be happy to pick the people that we tell him to pick and put on the court, right? I mean, this is the far left talking. And so I think that's one of the most sinister and vile threats to our constitutional order, to the rule of law, to not just religious freedom, but all freedoms in this country, because that's a one-way ratchet, right? Once you give the power to a president to add seats to the Supreme Court and then fill those seats with whomever he or she handpicks, you can't go back. And I'll give one historical anecdote to prove this. In Venezuela, before the current regime under President Chavez, the Venezuelan Supreme Court, I think at that time had its Supreme Court had, it was around 9 or 13 justices on the Venezuela Supreme Court. And if you look at the rulings from the Supreme Court from this, we're talking maybe, the 70s and 80s into the early to mid 90s. And it was about, about what you would expect. They would rule in favor of the government regime half the time. They would rule against them half the time. Okay, 50-50. That's probably what most people would expect. The Chavez regime comes in, totalitarian dictatorship, right? Completely run the country into the ground. What was once a very wealthy, prosperous nation has now been completely run into the ground. And he doesn't, and he says, oh, I gotta make sure that the Supreme Court always upholds my decisions. So he adds, I think he doubled the size of the Venezuela Supreme Court, packed it with his own people. And since then, the Venezuela Supreme Court has issued, I believe it's around 20 or 30,000 decisions in the roughly 25 years that we've had a Chavez dictatorship in Venezuela, and it has ruled against the regime 0 times.
Wow!
Out of 20 to 30,000 decisions, they have not once gone against the dictator.
Wow!
So that tells you from our own generation, our own modern history, we can see it for our eyes, right? This is not something you have to look up in a history book. It's happening before our eyes. They will not rule against the person that essentially created their job. And that's how you destroy a country from within.
So you make your ideology's regime then impenetrable. There would be no theoretical way to stop it.
Right.
Yeah, this is so fascinating
Google.
to me because I'm just hearing so many people talk about judicial reform, and they're always couching it in terms of democracy. We need to democratize the courts, but what you're saying is it's actually the opposite. When it's actually put into practice, it essentially makes the court puts the court at the service of whatever totalitarian aims the ideology in charge might have.
just again, it's up to us as American citizens to get past the headlines and the clever messaging and the packaging and actually read what's in this case, it's a bill that's been submitted to Congress, right? And just read what they actually want to do. And so all the fancy packaging and labeling and marketing says reform, and as you're saying, you democratize the courts or bring the courts back to the people. You've got to get past all that and actually look and see the language of what are they actually trying to do. And there's no other way to describe it than pack the courts.
Wow.
They want to increase the number of seats on the Supreme Court so that they can choose and hand select who gets put on there. Now, think about this. What's the other piece of that? Term limits, right? So what they're doing is saying, oh, and once you reach a certain age, you've aged out. Well, who happen to be the oldest justices on the Supreme Court right now? They all happen to be the most conservative justices on the court, are the oldest justices. So it's a very clever way to say, oh, gosh, Justice Thomas, Justice Alito, I'm sorry, but you've hit the age of whatever, right? You're term limited or age limited. We've got to give your seat to somebody else. Oh, and it just happens to be that we control the White House, so we get to pick. So again, ignore the packaging and the clever marketing schemes and look and see what they're actually trying to do. And think, the question I always tell young people is ask yourself who stands to gain the most from whatever it is that somebody is trying to pass. Who stands to gain the most?
Wow. Well, this is really good. You've drawn between two dots. It's a clear line now that you're talking about it between all of the talk about quote unquote court reform and the actual issue of religious liberty. And I hadn't seen those two things in quite that way together. I want to take a little bit of a turn toward the military because this is a special focus of yours. You are focused on helping to secure religious liberty for people in the military. And I think probably a lot of people are going to be pretty shocked to discover that the military can actually be one of the unfriendliest places to religious freedom. Now, I'm not saying that to denigrate the United States Armed Forces. I'm just wanting to point out the fact that the threats are real all the way across the government, including in places that people have generally thought to be more conservative.
Yeah, the United States military for many, many years, right, was often considered sort of this last bastion of traditional American conservative values, right? That's what our military is just by virtue of the majority of the people who are recruited and who join the military. Now, once again, whether you open a paper, turn on the TV, or get your news from your device, right, your mobile device, you can hardly go a day without hearing something about the recruiting and retention crisis that is plaguing our military, because it's one of the worst recruiting and retention crises in our nation's history.
Wow!
And so I'm speaking not only as somebody who fights for religious freedom on the outside as an attorney, as a constitutional litigator, but also as somebody who is a veteran, right? I've served. I continue to serve as a reservist, right, in the military. So I'm on the outside looking in, and I'm on the inside looking out. And I can tell you, to me, I can't speak for everyone, but I'll make this one caveat. The vast majority of people in our military are patriotic, America-loving people, right? They want the best for this country, and they serve for noble and honorable reasons. But there are always going to be that percentage of people who probably shouldn't be there, right? Who are not because they're malicious or nefarious, but just they slip between the cracks somehow and they don't belong there. And maybe they are not there for the right reasons. They're there for themselves. They're there for because it looks great on a resume or whatever the case might be. Okay, there are always going to be some of those in any large organization, especially one as large as the U.S. military. And this is what we see happening: is the military, our Pentagon officials, and our national leaders right now are banging their head into the wall, thinking, "How do we solve this recruiting and retention crisis?" Right? Because it is a crisis, and it's a matter of national security. If we don't have a military that's large enough to defend our nation, then we can't defend the nation.
Right.
It's as simple as that. It's a numbers game often, right? And that pipeline has just got to continue, right? You can't just look and say, "Oh, we recruited at X% this year." It's every person you recruited, you got to re-earn that recruit, next year and next year and next year. And so they have these projections that just go out for years of saying this is how many people we need to defend our nation. And so they're banging their heads on the wall in the Pentagon and saying, what is going on? Why are people not joining the military? Because I also want to make this point. We have an all-volunteer force. We haven't had conscription. We haven't had a draft since the early 70s. So we're going on half a century now of an all-volunteer military force. And in an all-volunteer force, in order for an all-volunteer military force to actually be able to sustain itself and do its job and succeed, right, you have to have one important, or a number of important things, but one of the most important factors is it has to present a more attractive and appealing option to people it wants to recruit than the other options available. So what am I saying? 18 to 24 years old is the prime recruiting target, right? 18 to 20 Americans 18 to 24 who have no criminal record or minimal criminal record, right? Because nowadays they're you can get waivers for one-time recreational drug use, and things that they used to be absolute non-starters when I joined are now, the military calls it widening the aperture. I just call it lowering standards. And I'm sorry, but I'm just going to call it how I see it. All right. And so the military, in order to have an all-volunteer force, those young people, 18 to 24, have to say, you know what? I would rather join the military than go to college, than get a job, than continue to live in mom and dad's basement, whatever the case might be, right? They have to decide that they would rather join the military than do those things. If those other things, whatever those other things might be, present a more attractive option, we see our military recruiting numbers plummet. And the same thing on the retention side, right? The people who are already in the military, guess what? Everybody in the military, they're not just there like indefinitely. They have a contract. And once their contract of enlistment ends, the military now has the opportunity to tell them, we would like you to stay, right? We'd like you to re-enlist is what we call it. In other words, renew your contract for another 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, whatever the case is. And in order for that person to say, I would like to do that, I would like to re-enlist, once again, the military has to show that it presents a more attractive and appealing option than getting out and doing whatever, starting life somewhere else and doing something else, okay? And when the military fails at that, fails to do that, that's when we see recruiting and retention numbers plummet the way they have. Now, here's my point. Why are we seeing those recruiting and retention numbers plummeting? Why is the military not able to make those more appealing and attractive options? Well, I'll hazard a guess. It's because we have a current generation of Americans aged 18 to 24, okay, who've been told almost since birth, or at least since they were in preschool, right? They've been indoctrinated to believe that America is a terrible place.
Wow. Yeah.
That we are an evil country, that we are inherently flawed, that there are any number of other countries who do it much better than we do, right? In any number of categories. And then when they turn 18 and the recruiter comes knocking and says, hey, young man, young woman, we would love, Uncle Sam needs you. Is it any shock that when the young person says, well, America is this inherently evil place. Why on earth would I want to sacrifice my life, to serve? And so here's the second piece of that ties in directly to religious liberty. And this is why I tell everybody I can religious liberty is actually a national security matter. And it's because according to every measurable statistic out there, or every survey that I've seen, and I haven't seen any that say otherwise, the demographic of Americans that is most likely to join the military, okay, is in the age 18 to 24 range, who self-identify as highly religious. That is the demographic that is most likely to join the military.
Okay. Yep.
And yet, as you said it a minute ago, you nailed it when you said that the military, much to many people's surprise, is one of the most hostile environments to people of faith. So you have this culmination of factors, right? You have our public school system teaching young Americans that America is bad. You have the military becoming an environment that tells people of faith, you're not welcome here. And yet, when they reach the age of which they can join the military looks at them and says, why don't you want to join? And they say, because I believe that America is bad, and even if I'm a person of faith who otherwise has an interest in joining the military, right? So in other words, they haven't lost their idealism, they haven't lost their patriotism. They don't believe that they're going, as we talked about at the very beginning, that they believe that the military will not permit them to live out their faith openly while serving in uniform. So that in a nutshell, or a little bit more than a nutshell, is how we get to where we are right now.
That is fascinating to see. So you've actually cut off the two kinds of people who would be most likely and able to serve vigorously and competently. If you teach people America's basically bad, and then say, even if you think it's good, this is not a place where you can actually be free to exercise your faith. I was with the students at a service academy, and they very, very polite about this. They were not disrespectful of their authorities at all, but it became pretty clear that they actually felt some constraints in practicing their faith. And some of them were really wrestling through this because they're like, well, you know what? The military is not obligated to make my faith life easier, or they were a little bit making excuses for it. How do you develop a strong military that is welcoming of people of religious faith without turning it into like a big youth group? I don't know if that question makes any sense, but I just wonder if, what that path forward is. Because I know what the people for Freedom from Religion Foundation say, and I know what military chaplains say, but, where do we go?
Yeah, I think as a person of faith who served in the military, and I served with fellow people of faith, and I served with fellow people who had either no faith or very different faith, right, than mine. And so from my own personal experience, I can say that to me, faith is a force multiplier, right? And that's a military term that we use to mean it makes you better at whatever it is you're supposed to do. And our military, right, and I would probably say any military on the planet that's ever existed in history has only ever really had two functions: to win war and to deter war, right? So you either win war or you make the other side believe that if they try to fight you, it's a losing proposition. And everything you do in the military has to be towards those two ends, right? Everything you do. I don't care whether it's a PowerPoint presentation or a chapel service that you attend, it needs to make you better at that, at one of those two things. And that's how I carried myself as a Marine officer. And I still believe that to this day, that's my advice to young people, is to sharpen your skills, right? As a military person, become, as we say in the military, tactically and technically proficient at what you're doing. But that doesn't mean that you have to strip yourself of your identity as a person of faith. And so I certainly agree that the military, its job isn't to coddle, right? It's not a daycare. It's not there to make your life easier. But at least according to the Constitution and federal courts, in actual published court decisions, the military and our nation has an obligation to provide for the free exercise of religion by our service members, because it doesn't make sense any other way. The very people who are fighting, sacrificing, and sometimes paying the ultimate sacrifice for our freedoms should not lose the very freedoms that they are sacrificing to protect.
Yeah.
Right.
That's so good. Well, Mike, we only have a few minutes left, but I wonder, and I hope this isn't unfair, I just wonder if we could do sort of a brief rundown of what people's religious liberty would mean to them in different arenas. So I'm thinking of people in the workplace, teachers, students, people in the military. Is there a way to just give a brief summary for each of those to say, okay, here's what freedoms you have that you might not even realize you have based on the Constitution? Like, start with teachers.
I'm so glad you asked this question, because we actually, on the heels of 2 consecutive Supreme Court victories at the Supreme Court just this last term, right? So the 2022 term at the Supreme Court.
And the cases you're referring to are the Coach Kennedy case.
Coach Kennedy
He
case
had the
and
freedom to pray on the
Right.
field, and people could join him or not. Okay.
Now, again, this has sort of been our theme right today. Don't just take that decision at face value. People have got to dig in deep. And I realize there's a lot, it's a long decision. It's written by judges. And so there's a lot of legalese in there. So I'm going to unpack what that decision means. The other decision was the school choice case, Carson v. Macon out of Maine. And so we have an entire campaign built off of those 2 cases, or they actually was just spurred by those 2 cases. And it's called Restoring Faith in America. Because what we began to realize was that as a result of those 2 cases, if you unpack those 2 decisions and what they actually mean, it goes far beyond just a football coach praying on a field, or just a school in Maine being free from discrimination by the state. What they're actually saying is that as Americans, it's sort of this yes, you can approach, right? Hey, First Liberty, I'm not a football coach, but I'm a teacher in a public school, and I like to pray before every class. Can I do that? Yes, you can. Hey, First Liberty, I'm a principal or an assistant principal at my local middle school, and I like to say grace before my meal, and I'm in the cafeteria surrounded by 300 kids. Am I allowed to do that? Yes, you can. Hey, First Liberty, right? And so in our public schools, students, teachers, administrators, coaches, principals, you do not have to check your faith at the schoolhouse gates. You can take your faith with you into the schoolhouse. Yes, you can, right? In the workplace, right? I work for a private company. They have these affinity groups, right? They have affinity groups for everything, from people who are kite flyers to model airplane builders to social justice devoted groups to whatever, right? I want to have a Bible study affinity group. Can I do that? Yes, you can. It's federal law that says they can't discriminate against you on that basis. Hey, First Liberty, I am an employee for the government, and I need a religious accommodation for whatever the case might be. And we have a case at the U.S. Supreme Court right now involving a former postal worker who was terminated because for many years he didn't have to work on Sundays. That's exactly why he went to go work for the Postal Service, is because he was a Sabbath observant Christian. And as when we grew up, the Postal Service didn't deliver on Sunday,
Yeah.
right? Well, then they began long story short, they began requiring their mail workers to begin delivering on Sundays. He couldn't do that, ended up getting fired for it. And so the question is, if we win this case, what does this mean? This means if you are an employee and you request a reasonable accommodation, right, that in order to support your religious exercise in the workplace, yes, you can. Okay, they cannot discriminate against you on that basis. In the military, I'm serving in the military, and I want to be able to be an outward person of faith. I want to have a Bible on my desk. I want to wear a cross chain, probably under my uniform, right? Can I do that? Yes, you can. Can I hold a Bible study with my fellow, people in the military? Yes, you can. Can we pray before we go out on a mission? Yes, you can. Right. And I'm not just saying yes, you can because oh yeah, some guy named Mike Berry told me I can. I mean, these are all. I'm talking federal law, Supreme Court precedent, etc. That says backs me up on what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So in just about every facet of life in this country, we have the right as Americans to live out our faith openly, freely, without discrimination, without hostility. But to go back to what I said at the very beginning, the only way that continues to be the case is if we stand upon those rights. And I'll say this and I'll stop. I know we're short on time, but one of the very first things you said to kick us off was you thanked me for my service. And for years, I often wrestled with how do I respond to somebody when they thank me for my service? Do I just say you're welcome? I mean, which is weird, And the more I thought about it, I finally so this is how I will respond to you thanking me for my service. And I say, if you really want to thank an American veteran or service member for their military service and the sacrifices they made, go out and live a life that's worthy of the sacrifices that they made. Right? Live out your freedoms. And the same thing goes for religious freedom. People all the time come to me and say, thank you so much to you and First Liberty for what you do for our freedoms, for our religious freedom every single day. And instead of saying you're welcome, my response to them is, if you really want to thank us, then go out and exercise your religious freedom. Because if you don't do what you do as American people, we can't do what we do as First Liberty Institute.
Yeah. Man, that is such a great way to end the program. So people go where to get that document that you mentioned? Because we all need to be reading that to review the freedoms that we have and to exercise them. Maybe you didn't even want to have a Bible study up until now, but you need to have one. You need to exercise these freedoms in order to keep them alive. But where do they find that document?
And if you don't want to have a Bible study, I promise you work with somebody who probably does, right? So firstliberty.org is our main website. And then the Restoring Faith in America initiative is at rfia.org. So that stands for Restoring Faith in America, rfia.org.
rfia.org. Mike, thanks for being on the show today. So grateful.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you to my guest today, Michael Berry, for coming on the show. The prophet Amos, you should go back and read it in the Old Testament. He says that if we're focused more on the performance of our faith than in providing justice, then we're on the wrong track. In fact, in Amos chapter 5, he says, take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps, but let justice flow like a river and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. We need to be people of justice so that we can be people of freedom in our culture. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to today's episode. The Dr. Jeff Show podcast is a resource of Summit Ministries. Summit equips and supports the rising generation to embrace God's truth and champion a biblical worldview. If you want more resources that can help you live out a biblical worldview as a student or reach the next generation as an educator, church leader, or parent, head over to summit.org/resources to find out about the programs, the articles, the videos, the ebooks, and more that we offer. Also, if you're looking for more great podcasts that will build your faith and inspire you, our friends at Edify have what you need. You can find more podcasts, including the Dr. Jeff Show podcast, on the Edify app. Download it at edify.app, spell EDIFI, and then you can also search for it in the Apple Store or the Google Play Store.